It was June 1942, and George John Dash was standing in a dirty phone booth somewhere in Washington, D.C., his hands shaking as he held the receiver, trying to convince the person on the other end of the line that he was not crazy, not a drunk making a prank call, but rather a Nazi spy who had just landed on American soil with direct orders from Adolf Hitler to blow up factories, bridges, and train stations, and that now, for reasons he could not fully explain even to himself, have you ever had that brilliant idea, that perfect solution to a gigantic problem, and when you went to tell someone who could do something about it, that person looked at you like you were crazy, like you did not know anything, like you were too small, too insignificant, too inexperienced to be, right? Have you ever felt the frustration of holding the solution in your hands and nobody, absolutely nobody, taking you seriously? Well, George Dash was living the worst nightmare of that feeling, because he was not trying to sell a startup idea, he was literally trying to prevent terrorist attacks on American soil, and the bureaucracy, the disbelief, the lack of vision of the people on the other side were letting time pass, and every minute that passed was one more minute for his former mission companions to disappear into the shadows of American cities and fulfill the mission that the Nazis had planned so carefully. The story you are about to hear is not about perfect heroes. It is not about systems that work. It is not about immediate recognition of talent or courage. It is about a man who made the craziest decision of his life, who risked absolutely everything to do what he thought was right, and who was treated like an idiot, like a liar, like irrelevant, until finally, too late for his ego but early enough to save lives, someone decided to listen. And if you think the problem of not being taken seriously is something modern, something from the age of social media and pompous titles, you will discover that in 1942, even when the fate of an entire nation was at stake, bureaucracy and arrogance could still be stronger than common sense. Operation Pastorius was conceived in the corridors of the Abwehr, the military intelligence service of Nazi Germany, as a direct response to the entry of the United States into World War II. Hitler was furious that America, that nation he so despised and at the same time feared, was now mobilizing all its industrial capacity to produce weapons, ships, planes, and supplies that were being sent to Great Britain and the Soviet Union, keeping European resistance against the Reich alive. The idea was simple and at the same time audacious. Send trained saboteurs to American territory, have them land secretly via submarines, and then execute a series of coordinated attacks against critical infrastructure targets, causing panic, disrupting war production, and demonstrating to the American people that not even on their own territory were they safe. The targets were carefully chosen. The Niagara Falls hydroelectric plant, which supplied power to aluminum factories vital for aircraft production, the Ohio Canal locks, strategic railway bridges, train stations in New York and Newark, and even Jewish department stores to spread terror among the civilian population. To execute this mission, the Abwehr recruited men who had something in common. All had lived in the United States at some point in their lives, spoke fluent English, knew American culture, and theoretically could blend in with the population without raising suspicion. George John Dash was one of those men, and his personal story was a chaotic mixture of frustrated ambition, opportunism, and a complicated relationship with his own identity. Dash was born in Germany in 1903, but at age 19 he boarded a ship as a crew member and ended up jumping off when he arrived in the United States, where he lived illegally for years, working various jobs, from waiter to dishwasher, always dreaming of being someone bigger, always feeling he deserved more than life was giving him. He was not particularly Nazi, not a fervent ideologue, not a dedicated soldier. He was just a guy who wanted to be important, who wanted to be recognized, who wanted to finally prove to himself and the world that he was no longer a failed immigrant washing dishes in New York. When the war began and he was back in Germany, the opportunity to join a secret mission, to be trained as a spy, to receive a considerable amount of money and be sent back to America with an important mission, seemed exactly the kind of recognition he had been seeking all his life. Along with Dash, 7 other men were selected. Ernest Peter Berger, who had been a member of the SA and Nazi stormtroopers but had his own reasons for being dissatisfied with the regime, Heinrich Heinck, Richard Quirin, Hermann Neubauer, Werner Thiel, Edward Curling, and Herbert Haupt. They were sent to a farm near Berlin where they spent weeks being trained in sabotage, learning to use explosives, create incendiary devices, communicate through codes, infiltrate industrial facilities, and live as ordinary Americans without raising suspicion. The plan was to divide them into two groups. One would land on Long Island near New York and the other in Florida. And then they would spread across the country, establish secret bases, and begin executing attacks over 2 years. On June 12, 1942, the German submarine U-202 surfaced off the coast of Amagansett Beach on Long Island around 11 at night, on a foggy night that seemed perfect for the operation. Dash, Berger, Heinck, and Quirin disembarked in an inflatable boat, carrying heavy boxes full of explosives, detonators, timers, German army uniforms so they could be treated as prisoners of war if captured instead of spies subject to execution, and an absurd amount of American money, more than $80,000, to finance the operation. The problem is that their luck ran out on the beach, because while they were burying the material in the sand and trying to change from German uniforms to civilian clothes, a young Coast Guard named John Cullen appeared walking along the beach as part of his nightly patrol. Cullen was not expecting to find anyone at that hour, much less a group of agitated men messing with boxes near the water, and when he approached with his flashlight, Dash panicked, but not the kind of panic that makes you run or fight, but the kind of panic that makes you start inventing absurd stories. Dash said they were fishermen who had run aground, that they did not want trouble, and when Cullen insisted he needed to see identification and understand what was happening, Dash completely changed tactics and tried to bribe him, stuffing money into the Coast Guard's hand and saying something like, "Look, you did not see anything here. Take this money and forget we exist." Cullen, who was not an idiot and realized something very wrong was happening. When Cullen returned with reinforcements a few hours later, the men had already disappeared into the darkness, but the boxes were still buried in the sand, and when they were opened, they revealed the entire sabotage arsenal that the Nazis had brought. Meanwhile, Dash and his companions took the first train to New York and checked into separate hotels, following the original plan to disperse and establish contacts. But something had changed in Dash during that encounter on the beach. Maybe it was the fear of being caught. Maybe it was the realization that the mission was already compromised before it even began. Maybe it was a crisis of conscience about what he was about to do. Or maybe, and this is what many historians believe, it was simply the recognition that he never had the real intention of executing the mission and was just waiting for the right moment to surrender and be seen as a hero. Dash began talking to Berger, who also had doubts about the mission, and together they began to consider the possibility of betraying the operation and handing everything over to American authorities. Dash's idea was not simply to prevent the attacks, it was to do it in a way that would turn him into a hero, that would make the Americans recognize his courage, that would put him in the newspapers as the man who saved America from a terrible threat. He imagined headlines, he imagined recognition, he imagined finally being someone important. So George Dash made the most important and most frustrating phone call of his life. He went to a phone booth and called the FBI office in New York, asking to speak to someone important because he had information about Nazi spies on American soil. The person who answered thought he was a lunatic, one of thousands of phone calls the FBI received at that time from paranoid people reporting neighbors, co-workers, or simply making up stories to get attention. Dash insisted, said he had real information, that he knew names, dates, targets, that he had money to prove his story, but the response was basically, "Yes, sir. Write down your name and phone number, and someone will get in touch." Dash hung up the phone completely frustrated, realizing that his great heroic move was being treated like just another war prank. But Dash was not the type of person who gave up easily when it came to seeking recognition, so he decided to raise the stakes. He took a train to Washington, D.C., went to the Mayflower Hotel, one of the fanciest hotels in the capital, rented an expensive room, and called the FBI again, this time to the central office, insisting that he needed to speak to someone high-ranking because he had information about a Nazi sabotage operation that was happening at that very moment. Have you ever been in that situation where you know you are right, where you know you have the solution to a serious problem, but people simply will not listen to you because you do not have the right position, because you do not have the right connections, because you do not fit the profile of who should have that information? Have you ever felt that helpless anger of seeing bureaucracy, hierarchy, protocol, getting in the way of something that should be simple? Well, that is exactly what George Dash was feeling, and it is exactly what millions of people feel every day when they try to do the right thing and run into systems that were not made to listen, but to filter, to distrust, to follow procedures instead of using common sense. Now, I want to know from you, have you ever lived a situation where you tried to warn someone about a real problem and were ignored because bureaucracy or other people's egos were stronger than logic? Tell us here in the comments. I tried to warn, and nobody listened to me. It may seem like a small thing, but when you share your experience, you help other people realize they are not alone in this fight against systems that prioritize form over content. And that is important, because that is how we start to change things. Recognizing that the problem is not with you, it is with the system that insists on not listening to those who really know. After more frustrated phone calls and being basically ignored by attendants who thought he was just another crazy person, Dash finally got an audience at the FBI office in Washington. He entered the building with a suitcase full of money, $84,000 in American bills, which he threw on the table as proof that he was not making up stories. Even so, the agents initially treated him with suspicion, asking questions, checking details, trying to find inconsistencies in his story. Dash spent hours being interrogated, telling the whole story from recruitment in Germany, training on the farm near Berlin, the submarine trip, landing on Long Island, the encounter with the Coast Guard, the names of the other saboteurs, the planned targets, everything. He expected immediate gratitude, expected to be treated like a hero, expected recognition, but what he received was treatment as a suspect, because after all, how could the agents be sure he was not just telling that story to gain immunity while his companions executed the mission? How could they know if he was not just handing over part of the operation to protect a larger part? The paranoia was understandable, but for Dash it was unbearable, because he had risked absolutely everything, had betrayed his country, his companions, had crossed a line that had no return, and was being treated as if he were a clever criminal trying to deceive the system. Eventually, after checking some of the details Dash provided and realizing that everything matched the Coast Guard report in Amagansett and the materials found buried on the beach, the FBI began to take the story seriously. They placed Dash in protective custody while organizing an operation to capture the other saboteurs before they could execute any attacks. Berger, who was with Dash in the plan to betray the mission, also surrendered and provided more information. With the details provided by the two traitors, the FBI managed to locate and arrest Heinck and Quirin in New York. Meanwhile, the second group of saboteurs, who had landed in Florida days later without knowing the operation was already compromised, were also quickly located and captured. Curling, Haupt, Neubauer, and Thiel were arrested before they could execute any part of the plan. Within 2 weeks, the entire Operation Pastorius had been dismantled. No attack was executed, no target was damaged, and 8 Nazi saboteurs were in American custody. From a national security standpoint, it was an absolute success. From a public relations standpoint and giving credit where credit was due, it was a complete mess. The FBI, under the direction of J. Edgar Hoover, decided to present the capture of the saboteurs as the result of brilliant investigative work by the agency, completely minimizing the role of Dash and Berger in the operation. Hoover did not want to publicly admit that the greatest counterintelligence operation of the war up to that point had only been successful because one of the spies himself had handed over everything on a silver platter. This would make the FBI look incompetent after all. If it were not for Dash's call, which had been initially ignored, how many attacks would have been executed before the agency discovered what was happening? So the official narrative was constructed to give all credit to FBI agents, who had supposedly tracked the saboteurs through meticulous investigative work, intensive surveillance, and superior intelligence. Dash was furious when he realized he was not being recognized, that he was not being treated as a hero, that his photo was not in the newspapers as the man who saved America, but rather was being kept silent as an inconvenient detail of the official story. The 8 saboteurs were tried by a special military commission created by President Franklin Roosevelt, in a trial that lasted a few weeks and was widely criticized afterwards for not following the normal legal procedures of the American justice system. 6 of the men, including Heinck, Kieran, Curling, Haupt, Neubauer, and Thiel, were sentenced to death and executed in the electric chair in August 1942, just 2 months after landing on American soil. Dash and Berger, for cooperating with authorities, received lighter sentences. Dash was sentenced to 30 years in prison and Berger to life imprisonment. Even having betrayed the mission, even having handed over all the details, even having prevented the attacks, Dash received neither pardon nor public recognition. He received only a prison sentence that seemed like a cruel joke after everything he had risked. He spent years in federal prison, bitter, resentful, writing letters to anyone who might listen to him, insisting that he was a misunderstood hero, that he had saved American lives, that he deserved gratitude and not punishment. In 1948, 6 years after Operation Pastorius, President Harry Truman granted executive clemency to Dash and Berger, but with one condition. They would be deported to Germany and could never return to the United States. For Dash, this was the final insult. He had betrayed his homeland to help America, had risked his life, had spent years in prison, and now was being expelled from the country he had tried to save, sent back to a Germany destroyed by war, where he would be seen as a traitor by Germans and where he no longer had family, friends, or future. He spent the rest of his life in Germany, poor, lonely, unsuccessfully trying to get American authorities to recognize his contribution, writing his version of the story in articles and a book that almost no one read, and dying in 1992 at age 89, completely forgotten by both Americans and Germans, a man who belonged to neither of the two worlds he had tried to navigate. The story of George Dash is fascinating because it completely breaks the simple narrative of heroes and villains that we normally expect from this kind of story. Dash was not a noble hero fighting for freedom. He was an opportunist seeking recognition. He was not a dedicated Nazi villain to Hitler's cause. He was a morally flexible guy who agreed to participate in a sabotage mission because it seemed like an opportunity to be important. And when he decided to betray the mission, it was not necessarily because of high moral principles or love for America. It was because he realized there was a way to be even more important, to be the guy who saved the country instead of just another saboteur executing orders. The problem is that he completely underestimated how power systems work, how bureaucracy protects itself, how institutions prefer to tell stories that make them look competent instead of admitting they were saved by luck or the convenient betrayal of one of the enemies. Dash thought he lived in a world of simple narratives where the person who does the right thing receives automatic recognition, but he discovered in the worst possible way that the real world is much more complex, much more unfair, and much more interested in maintaining appearances than in giving credit where credit is due. J. Edgar Hoover's FBI was a master at controlling narratives, at transforming failures into successes through careful public relations, at ensuring the agency always looked omniscient and infallible in the eyes of the American public. Admitting that a Nazi spy had simply called them and handed over the entire operation, and that initially they had not even taken the call seriously, would have been disastrous for the agency's image. So the story was rewritten, details were omitted, and Dash was transformed from crucial informant into mere criminal who tried to make a deal to save his own skin. Even today, when you read the official history of Operation Pastorius in many sources, Dash's role is minimized or presented ambiguously, as if his betrayal were just a minor detail in a brilliant intelligence operation, when in fact it was literally the only reason the operation was discovered before any attack was executed. And this brings us to a deeper question about how history is told and who decides which stories deserve to be remembered and how. We like to think that the truth always comes out, that people who do important things are recognized, that merit is rewarded, but the reality is much more complicated. The reality is that institutions have an interest in telling versions of history that make them look good, that governments construct narratives that justify their actions and strengthen their authority, that people in power decide who is a hero and who is a villain based not necessarily on what happened, but on what is convenient to say happened. George Dash did not fit the convenient narrative, so he was erased from it. Simple as that. And how many other people throughout history did important things? Things that changed the course of events. Things that saved lives but were forgotten or minimized because they did not fit the story someone wanted to tell. If you are enjoying discovering these stories of ordinary people who faced giant systems, who had brilliant ideas that were ignored, who did the right thing and were punished for it, who challenged bureaucracy and the official narrative, then you need to subscribe to this channel. We do not tell the stories you already know. We do not repeat the official version of the facts. We dive deep into the contradictions, the ironies, the historical injustices that show how the world really works. Every week, there is a new video about anonymous geniuses, about people who were erased from history, about inconvenient truths that do not fit in the simplified narratives we learn in school. Subscribe, turn on notifications, and come with us to discover the stories they do not want you to know, because knowledge is power, and the more you understand about how systems really work, the more you can navigate through them without being swallowed. Operation Pastorius was not the only Nazi sabotage attempt on American soil, but it was by far the most ambitious and the one that came closest to causing real damage. There were other smaller operations, other spies, other infiltration attempts, but none with the level of planning, resources, and specific objectives of Pastorius. The fact that it failed completely, and failed not because the FBI was so competent, but because one of the saboteurs himself decided to hand over everything, should have been a warning about the vulnerabilities of the American security system at the time. But instead of using the case as an opportunity to improve procedures, to create better protocols for dealing with informants, to recognize the failures that almost allowed 8 men armed with explosives to spread across the country without being detected, the official narrative turned everything into a tale of American intelligence success. Historians who studied Operation Pastorius in detail, especially after classified documents were released decades later, discovered that the mission was doomed to failure even without Dash's betrayal. The saboteurs' training was inadequate. The planning was full of flaws. The selection of targets was more based on propaganda than real strategic impact, and coordination between the different groups was practically non-existent. Even if all 8 men were fully committed to the mission, the chances of them being able to execute significant attacks without getting caught were very low. But this does not diminish the fact that Dash effectively prevented any possibility of damage, and that he did so by taking enormous personal risk. Because if the Nazis had discovered his betrayal before the arrest of the other members, he would have been killed immediately. And if the Americans had decided not to believe him or had taken longer to act, he could have been executed along with the others as a conspirator. The moral question about George Dash is complicated and has no easy answer. On one hand, he voluntarily joined a Nazi sabotage mission, agreed to kill innocent civilians if necessary, accepted money to execute terrorist attacks, and only changed his mind when he realized the mission was compromised and there was an opportunity to gain something for himself by betraying the Nazis. On the other hand, regardless of motivations, the end result was that he prevented attacks that could have killed people and caused widespread panic. He provided detailed information that allowed the capture of all other saboteurs, and he took enormous personal risk in doing so. We can say he was a cowardly traitor who only thought of himself, or we can say he was a courageous informant who did the right thing at the critical moment. The truth is probably somewhere in the middle, in that uncomfortable space where most human actions actually happen, far from the clean categories of hero and villain that we prefer to use. The psychological impact of Operation Pastorius on the American public was significant, even though no attack was executed. The simple fact that Nazi saboteurs had managed to land on American beaches, armed with explosives and money, was a shock to the population that had become accustomed to thinking that the war was something that happened on the other side of the ocean. Suddenly, the war was here, on the coast of Long Island, in Florida, potentially anywhere. The government used the case as justification to increase security measures, to expand the FBI's powers, to justify arrests and deportations of people considered threats to national security, often based on nothing more than ethnic origin or perceived political sympathies. Operation Pastorius, despite having failed, ended up serving the propaganda purposes of both the Nazis, who could say they had penetrated the American fortress and the American government, which could use the case as justification for increasingly authoritarian measures in the name of national security. The trial of the saboteurs itself was a legal farce that established dangerous precedents about the use of military commissions to try civilians, about the suspension of constitutional rights in wartime, about the power of the executive to determine who has the right to a fair trial and who can be summarily executed. Defense lawyers tried to argue that the saboteurs should be tried in normal civil courts, with all the legal protections that implied, but the Supreme Court, in a decision that is still controversial and criticized today, decided that the president had authority to create special military commissions in wartime. The decision was quick, the trial was secret, and the executions were carried out with speed that would shock anyone familiar with the normal American criminal justice system, where appeals can take years or decades. 6 men were killed in less than 2 months after being captured, in a process that prioritized efficiency and political impact over any notion of careful justice. George Dash's life after deportation to Germany was a sad existence of failed attempts at rehabilitation and recognition. He gave interviews, wrote articles, published a book called 8 Spies Against America, where he told his version of the story, but none of this generated the recognition he so sought. Americans were not interested in reconsidering the official narrative. Germans saw him as a traitor who had caused the death of 6 compatriots, and he was stuck in this limbo of being rejected by both sides. He tried to sue the American government for unfair treatment, tried to get permission to return to the United States, tried to get financial compensation, but all these attempts were denied. He died in 1992 in Ludwigshafen, Germany, practically forgotten, an obscure footnote in a war full of much more dramatic and cinematic stories. What makes George Dash's story relevant is not just the historical drama of Operation Pastorius, but what it reveals about how systems of power, recognition, and narrative work. Dash did something objectively useful for the United States, regardless of his motivations. He prevented terrorist attacks that could have caused deaths and destruction. But because he was not the right kind of hero, because his story did not fit the narrative the FBI wanted to tell, because recognizing him would have meant admitting institutional failures, he was erased, minimized, and eventually punished. And this happens all the time, at all levels of society, where people who do important things are ignored, because they do not have the right profile, do not know the right people, do not know how to play the political game of promoting themselves and ensuring credit for their own work. We live in a culture that values the idea of meritocracy a lot, that talent and hard work are automatically recognized and rewarded. But the reality is that recognition is a social construction that depends much more on narratives, connections, timing, and luck than on pure merit. How many brilliant people died in anonymity because they did not have the right connections to have their work seen by the right people at the right time? How many important discoveries were attributed to the wrong person because they were in a better position to claim credit? How many crucial contributions were erased from history because they did not fit the narrative someone in a position of power wanted to tell? George Dash's story is just a particularly dramatic example of something that happens constantly, on a smaller scale, every day, where the system decides who deserves to be remembered and who deserves to be forgotten, based not on what you did, but on how convenient it is to recognize what you did. And perhaps the most important lesson from Dash's story is about motivations for doing the right thing. Dash did not betray the Nazi mission because he was morally superior, or because he loved America, or because he had unbreakable principles about not killing innocents. He betrayed because he saw an opportunity to be recognized, to be important, to finally be someone. And, ironically, it was exactly this search for recognition that destroyed him, because he never understood that systems do not give recognition based on what you deserve. They give recognition based on what is convenient for them. If Dash had betrayed the mission quietly, without seeking credit, without trying to be a hero, maybe he would have had a better fate. But he wanted the headlines, wanted public recognition, wanted to be seen as a savior, and this need for external validation was exactly what made it impossible for the FBI to admit his role, because doing so would have meant admitting their own failures. The story of Operation Pastorius is told in very different ways depending on who is telling it. In mainstream American history books, it is a success story of the FBI, of how American surveillance and intelligence were so superior that they managed to capture all Nazi saboteurs before any damage was caused. In more critical books, it is a story about the use of military commissions to bypass the normal justice system and execute people quickly without adequate constitutional protections. In books about espionage, it is a story about a poorly planned sabotage operation that was doomed to fail from the start. And in books about forgotten people from history, it is the story of George Dash, a deeply flawed man who did something objectively important and was completely erased from the official narrative because he did not fit the type of hero the system wanted to recognize. The final paradox of George Dash is that he spent his entire life seeking to be important, to be recognized, to be remembered, and ended up achieving exactly the opposite. He participated in one of the most dramatic events of World War II on American soil, played a crucial role in preventing terrorist attacks, and died completely forgotten, a historical curiosity that appears in specialized books but that practically no one knows. If he had simply executed the Nazi mission and been captured, he would have been executed like the others and would be a footnote in history as one of the 8 Nazi saboteurs. If he had stayed silent and never betrayed the mission, he probably would have been caught eventually and had the same fate. But by betraying and seeking recognition, he achieved the worst of both worlds. He survived, but in a life of misery, rejection, and oblivion. Hated by Germans as a traitor, ignored by Americans as an inconvenience, and trapped in a limbo of not belonging anywhere. There are few memorials or official recognitions of Operation Pastorius beyond some historical markers at Amagansett Beach, where the first group landed. There is no museum dedicated to the event. There are no monuments to the men who were executed. There is certainly nothing recognizing George Dash. The story has been largely forgotten by the American public, overshadowed by much larger and more dramatic events of World War II. Occasionally, a documentary or newspaper article appears retelling the story, usually focusing on the angle of the FBI capturing the spies, rarely mentioning the uncomfortable details about how the capture actually happened. It is as if collective history decided that the event does not fit any useful narrative, so it is easier to just let it disappear into obscurity. For historians and researchers who study intelligence and counterintelligence, Operation Pastorius is a fascinating case study on operational failures, on the importance of proper agent selection and training, on the risks of complex operations with multiple participants, and on how unexpected events can derail even the most carefully laid plans. The German Abwehr learned from the failure of the operation and never again attempted anything similar on such an ambitious scale on American territory. The FBI used the case as justification for massive expansion of its powers and budget during the war, and dozens of ordinary people who were arrested, interrogated, or deported as supposed threats to national security after Pastorius paid the price of a panic about spies that was amplified far beyond the real danger they represented. Dash's decision to betray the mission raises interesting philosophical questions about betrayal, loyalty, and morality. If you voluntarily join a malignant cause, but then change your mind and work against that cause, does that make you a hero or just a less committed traitor? If you do the right thing for the wrong reasons, seeking personal recognition instead of acting on principle, does the result still count as morally good? Dash did not have a sudden moral epiphany about the horrors of Nazism. He was not converted to American values of freedom and democracy. He simply calculated that there was more to gain by betraying than by executing the mission. And when that calculation proved wrong and he ended up in prison instead of in newspapers as a hero, he became bitter and resentful, not because justice was not done, but because he did not receive the reward he thought he deserved. But perhaps the most interesting thing is to think about the alternatives. If Dash had not betrayed, if he had kept his commitment to the mission, how many attacks would have been executed before the FBI discovered the operation? The honest answer is probably not many, because the operation was riddled with problems from the start. The saboteurs were poorly trained, poorly coordinated, operating in a country where they had no network support, with targets that were well protected, and where any suspicious activity would be quickly reported. But some attacks could have happened. Some people could have died. Some panic could have been caused. So in a very practical sense, regardless of Dash's motivations, he probably saved some lives. But saving lives does not automatically guarantee recognition or gratitude, especially when recognizing you is inconvenient for institutions in power. Dash's family, what was left of it after the war, never recovered from the association with the case. Being a relative of the traitor Nazi saboteur was not exactly a useful credential in either Germany or the United States. His descendants, if they exist, probably do not talk much about this part of family history because it is too complicated, carries too heavy judgments, does not fit into any comfortable family narrative. How do you explain to grandchildren that grandfather was simultaneously a Nazi spy, a traitor, an FBI informant, an American prisoner, a deportee, and a forgotten historical figure? There is no version of this story that makes anyone look good. There is no angle that transforms this into a proud narrative of ancestry. The lasting legacy of Operation Pastorius is not so much in the events themselves, which were relatively small in the grand scheme of World War II, but in the legal precedents it established. The Supreme Court decision allowing the use of military commissions to try terrorism suspects was cited decades later to justify similar treatment of prisoners at Guantanamo and elsewhere. The case demonstrated that in times of war or national crisis, constitutional rights can be suspended, normal legal processes can be ignored, and the executive power can have almost absolute authority over who lives and who dies. These are issues that continue to be debated today, and Operation Pastorius is often cited as a precedent example, both by those who defend expanded executive powers in the name of national security and by those who warn about the dangers of sacrificing civil liberties in times of crisis. George Dash probably never imagined that his legacy would be primarily as a case study in constitutional law books and intelligence history, an example of how not to conduct a sabotage operation if you are a Nazi, and an example of how not to seek recognition if you are an informant. He wanted to be a movie hero, to be celebrated, to be remembered with admiration. Instead, he became a footnote, a historical curiosity, an example of how the search for external validation can destroy you even when you do objectively important things. And maybe there is a lesson there about the difference between doing things because they need to be done versus doing things because you want to be recognized for doing them. Dash never learned that lesson. He spent decades after the war trying to get the recognition he thought he deserved, writing letters, giving interviews, seeking validation, and died frustrated and bitter because that validation never came. The story ends not with a dramatic resolution or poetic justice, but with a silent disappearance. George Dash died in 1992. Ernest Berger died in 1975, both in Germany, both in relative obscurity. The 6 executed saboteurs were buried in prisoner cemeteries. Their families in Germany received formal death notification. There were no grand ceremonies or recognitions. Operation Pastorius gradually left American public consciousness, replaced by more memorable, more cinematic events, more suitable for the narrative the culture prefers to tell about World War II. Occasionally, a historian or writer rediscovers the story and writes a book or makes a documentary, but it never really captures popular imagination the way other war stories do. It is too complex, too ambiguous, too uncomfortable, full of characters who are neither heroes nor villains but something confusing in between. And maybe it is appropriate that the story of George Dash, a man who spent his life trying to be important and being ignored, results in a story that culture itself ignores and forgets. There is a sad symmetry in that. a poetic justice of the cruelest kind. The man who wanted to be remembered is forgotten. The operation that should have changed the course of the war is a footnote. The executed men are faceless numbers. The Coast Guard who first discovered the saboteurs is a local curiosity. The FBI agents who conducted the arrests are anonymous, and everyone moves on as if none of it really mattered. But it did matter, at least to the people who lived it, to George Dash, who spent decades in the bitterness of non-recognition, to the 6 men executed who died for a mission they never had a chance to complete, to the Coast Guard who found strangers on the beach and made the right decision to report, to the families destroyed by war and betrayal. In the end, Operation Pastorius is a story about the chaos, randomness, and fundamental injustice of how recognition is distributed, how stories are told, how legacies are built. George Dash made a bold move seeking to be a hero and ended up as a footnote. The FBI made serious mistakes of not taking informants seriously and ended up being credited with brilliant investigative work. 6 men died quickly while 2 who cooperated were also punished. A country expanded its security powers using a danger that never materialized as justification. And decades later, almost no one remembers any of it, except some specialized researchers who occasionally dig through the archives and are fascinated by the strangeness of it all. This is the reality of history. It is not an organized narrative with clear lessons and poetic justice. It is a mess of complex decisions, mixed motivations, unintended consequences, and gradual forgetting of practically everything that does not fit the simple stories we prefer to tell.